For decades, the Iceman has mesmerized scientists, historians, and curious minds ever since hikers discovered him in the icy alpine terrain of the Ötzi Alps back in 1991, preserved for over 5,000 years beneath the glaciers. His remarkably intact body unlocked vital clues about life during Europe's Copper Age. From his last meal to his clothes, ailments, and even his violent death, we already know fascinating details. Ötzi's final meal included ibex and red deer alongside emmer wheat. He dressed in stitched hide clothing and woven grass, suffered from arthritis, intestinal parasites, and even evidence of Lyme disease. An arrow piercing his shoulder likely incapacitated him, causing a fatal fall or exposure after an impact to the head. Despite this wealth of information about the Iceman himself, who he was and what he ate, what remains less clear is the world around him. What did his society look like? Were the people around him genetically and culturally similar? Or was Tic truly unique? The question is precisely what a groundbreaking new study tackles. A research team from the Institute for Mummy Studies in Bolzano, Italy, sequenced ancient DNA from 47 individuals who lived in the Tyrolean Alps from approximately 6,400 to 1300 BCA. Timeframe spanning the Mesolithic through the Middle Bronze Age. Included in that group were 15 Copper Age individuals who lived in the same region and era as CES, around 3300 BC. Their goal, to directly compare TSES genetics to those of his neighbors' people who might have hunted the same animals, trekked nearby valleys, or traded across alpine passes. We know the alpine world CI entered was shaped by millennia of movement and resettlement. After glaciers withdrew around 18,000 years ago, Western hunter-gatherers populated the eastern Alps. By around 7000 BC, Anatolian farmers introduced agriculture and livestock, eventually blending with indigenous hunter-gatherers. By 4800 BC, alpine populations carried roughly 80 to 90% Anatolian farmer ancestry, pattern remarkably consistent across centuries and distinct from populations in Central Europe. This group's genetic makeup remained most similar to that of modern Sardinians. At first glance, C fits right into this picture. He and most of his neighbors carried about 80 to 90% Anatolian farmer ancestry, with low hunter-gatherer input. Phenotypically, they shared traits too, like dark hair, brown eyes, and lactose intolerance. But zoom in on the lineages, and things get interesting. When scientists examined paternal and maternal lines, C stood out in surprising ways. His paternal Y chromosome belonged to a rare branch of G2A, that docin. T matched the mountainous locals. Most of the nearby males carried a different G2A subclade shared across Europe. Even more striking is C's mitochondrial lineage, subclade K1F, a branch never recorded in any other ancient or modern human, suggesting it disappeared entirely. Meanwhile, despite his overall genetic similarity to others, modern comparisons show his paternal and maternal lines don't align with anyone else in the dataset. It's making him a clear outlier. So what does that mean for his neighbors and their society? The broader group shows a pattern often seen in patrilical societies. Most men share the same Y chromosome. While mitochondrial diversity is high, women came into villages from elsewhere, bringing varied maternal lines.
Assisi's
Uniqueness. But especially his rare maternal line points to a different origin, perhaps from Anatolia or northern Italy. As for their physical traits, in individuals with sufficiently complete genomes, researchers inferred dark brown to black hair and brown eyes, all consistent with C, and confirmed they were also lactose intolerant. Beyond just ancestry and lineage, the research team also investigated the broader patterns of social structure in C's world, and what they found paints a rich picture of community, its movement, and identity in the high Alps of the Copper Age. The genetic evidence suggests that these ancient alpine villages were patrilical, meaning men typically stayed in the same area they were born, inheriting land and traditions from their fathers. In contrast, the women's mitochondrial DNA tells a very different story. There was a wide variety of maternal lineages, among them haplogroups like H, J, K, U, V, and X, with rare subtypes such as H3K and J1C12B. That level of diversity suggests women were moving into the region from other communities, perhaps from neighboring valleys or even farther. They were likely joining the households of their husbands, bringing with them not just new genes, but also new customs, languages, or cultural elements. This pattern isn't just a fluke, it matches what we know from other ancient farming societies. Patrilocality was common across much of Neolithic and early Bronze Age Europe. It helped preserve male lineages across centuries, while allowing for the continual inflow of female ancestry from the outside. And it raises an interesting contrast with Cési's own case. Despite being a man, his Y chromosome lineage didn't match that of the dominant local male group, suggesting he either came from a different community or descended from an isolated family line that hadn't merged with the local population. And then there's his mother's lineage K1F. That's where things get really unusual. No other known individual in ancient or modern DNA databases shares this mitochondrial haplogroup. It's as if his maternal ancestry existed on a genetic island, now long gone. It raises all kinds of possibilities. Was his mother part of a small, isolated farming community that eventually disappeared? Did her people migrate from a far-off region like Anatolia or southern Italy, only to vanish from history without leaving a broader genetic footprint? The researchers caution that more ancient DNA samples are needed before we can say for sure. But already, C appears more genetically distinct than previously thought. And the mystery deepens when we look at physical traits and adaptations. 6 individuals from the same region, including Ti, likely had dark brown to black hair and brown eyes. That's consistent with their Anatolian farmer ancestry. Their skin tone ranged from light to medium, but the data wasn't detailed enough to make precise calls. What's more telling is their shared trait of lactose intolerance. None of them carried the genetic mutation that would allow them to digest milk into adulthood. That's a stark contrast with later European populations, where dairy consumption became widespread. It also helps explain the absence of dairy in Cési's last meal. Speaking of which, his final meal, a mix of ibex meat, red deer, einkorn wheat, and traces of bracken fernifores, a glimpse into the alpine diet of the time. It was a blend of hunting, farming, and gathering, precisely the kind of hybrid survival strategy you'd expect from people living in rugged terrain. This wasn't a society of sedentary cereal farmers or full-time herders. They adapted their lifestyle to a harsh, high-altitude environment. Hunting supplemented their food stores, while cultivated crops and gathered plants added variety. But food was only one part of survival. Cési's possessions, his copper axe, his flint dagger, his bow and arrows, and his carefully stitched clothing tell us even more about the world he lived in. That copper axe in particular is a standout artifact. Metallurgical analysis revealed that it came from Tuscany, hundreds of kilometers away from where Cési died. That tells us there were long-distance trade networks at play, networks capable of transporting not just ideas, but heavy, valuable tools and weapons across alpine passes. And it wasn't just copper. The region where Cési lived, archaeologists have found amber from the Baltic and obsidian from the Mediterranean. This wasn't an isolated pocket of humanity. It was part of a sprawling web of exchange linking far-flung cultures across prehistoric Europe. All of this raises the stakes for understanding Cési's identity. Was he a local man who stood out because of his unique ancestry? Or was he a traveler man moving along one of those ancient trade routes, bringing with him tools, goods, and stories from another world? His distinct genetic markers, his foreign maternal line, and the presence of a Tuscan copper axe all point toward the latter possibility. Then there's the matter of his death. An arrow lodged in his back, a wound to the head, possibly pushed off a cliff or left to freeze. Whatever happened, it was violent, and it wasn't random. Violence that leaves such marks, projectile weapons, head trauma suggests conflict. Was it personal? A robbery? Revenge? Or was CI the victim of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, maybe even targeted as an outsider, someone who didn't belong? We may never know for sure. But this study adds a compelling new layer to his story. Not only was TSE one of the most well-preserved mummies ever found, he was also genetically exceptional. Possibly the last of a fading lineage. What truly sets this study apart isn't just what it says about C, but what it reveals about the broader transformations underway in the Alps after his death. As the Copper Age gave way to the early Bronze Age around 2400 BC, something began to change. The genetic landscape of the Alps didn't stay frozen in time, it began to shift. New groups of people started arriving in the region, bringing with them not just new tools, animals, and customs, but entirely different genetic signatures. Among the most notable of these was the so-called steppe ancestry, named after the vast Pontic-Caspian steppe that stretches from Ukraine to western Kazakhstan. These were the people associated with the Yamnaya culture, horseback riders and metalworkers who migrated westward into Europe and left a massive imprint on the continent's population. Evidence of this steppe migration had already been detected in northern and central Europe, especially through the Bell-Beaker culture, widespread archaeological complex that fused local traditions with the incoming steppe influence. But here in the Alps, researchers have found that steppe ancestry arrived even earlier than previously believed. Some individuals from the Alpine region, like LO1 and VO1, who lived shortly after Cési's time, carried up to 30 to 35% steppe DNA significantly earlier than the influx seen in northern Italy. This early presence is a game-changer. It suggests that the Alps weren't just a passive, secluded mountain zone. They were a key route of migration, a corridor connecting east and west. These mountains, once a genetic refuge that preserved stable lineages like Cési's, became a melting pot of cultures, ancestries, and ideas. And with that influx came not just genetic change, but likely social and linguistic transformation as well. Other individuals analyzed in the study carried small traces of ancestry from the Caucasus and even the Iranian Neolithic, hinting at truly long-distance exchanges and movements of people. These weren't just traders skimming the surface of the continent, they were settlers, marrying into local communities and altering their genetic makeup for generations to come. And yet Suhu lived centuries before these sweeping changes shows no sign of them. His genome is almost untouched by steppe DNA, with roughly 90% Anatolian farmer ancestry and only a sliver of hunter-gatherer input. He represents a population that had remained remarkably stable and isolated for thousands of years. In a sense, C was the last of his kind, a remnant of a genetic world that was about to be overwhelmed and replaced by waves of newcomers. This makes his solitary death all the more haunting. A man whose people were genetically distinct, whose family line may have been vanishing, even in his own time, found high in the mountains, alone. It's no wonder his discovery sparked so much speculation and fascination. Was he fleeing? Exploring? Or had he been exiled or targeted? His violent end an arrow to the back, and possibly a final blow to the head leaves room for multiple interpretations. Maybe he was ambushed while hunting. Maybe it was a robbery gone wrong. Maybe he was involved in a feud or worse, a ritual killing. But now with this genetic data, another theory emerges, that he may have been perceived as an outsider. Someone whose family roots didn't quite match the rest of the valley. Someone whose presence triggered suspicion or hostility. In that sense, C becomes more than just an ancient corpse. He becomes a symbol of the transition between worlds. Between the last breath of the Neolithic and the first pulse of the Bronze Age. Between stability and upheaval. Between isolation and connection. And his story isn't over yet. This latest research opens doors to even more discoveries. As scientific techniques improve, and as more ancient genomes are uncovered and sequenced, we'll be able to draw sharper, clearer maps of human migration, social organization, and even individual lives. Every new skeleton unearthed from those high alpine passes, every fragment of bone stored in a museum or dig site could hold another piece of the puzzle. Was CI part of a fading lineage that once thrived in the Alps? Or was he a unique individual and outlier among outliers who happened to get caught up in the currents of his time? The answers may still be buried beneath the ice, waiting for the next hiker, the next archaeologist, the next scientific breakthrough. For now, what we do know is that Cési's genetic legacy is unlike any other. His DNA tells us of an ancient world on the brink of transformation, of a man who carried the traces of people long gone, and of how even a single life frozen in time can speak volumes about our shared human journey.
To fully appreciate the weight of Cési's story, it helps to understand just how rare his preservation isn't, how improbable it was that we found him at all. His body had been locked in glacial ice for over 5,000 years, shielded from decay, scavengers, and the shifting landscapes of time. When hikers stumbled upon his remains in 1991, it wasn't in a cave or burial mound. It was high on a windswept ridge near the Austrian-Italian border, just as the ice had retreated enough to reveal him. If that glacier hadn't melted at that moment, or if those hikers had walked another route, his story might have stayed frozen forever. And it's not just his body that was preserved. His clothes, gear, and even the contents of his stomach all survived the millennia. That allowed scientists to reconstruct not only how he lived, but also how he died. His garments included a coat made of stitched goat and sheep hides, leggings, a fur cap, and shoes padded with grass. His toolkit was no less impressive. A longbow, a quiver full of unfinished arrows, a copper axe, and a flint-bladed dagger. He even carried a birch bark container likely used to carry embers or medicinal plants. These artifacts, Dante, just reveal his survival skills. They also place him in a web of relationships that extended far beyond his alpine home. His copper axe, for example, came from Tuscany, indicating long distance, trade, or movement. That single item connects him to the metal workers of central Italy, whose smelting techniques marked one of the earliest uses of metal tools in prehistoric Europe. In the region where he lived, archaeologists have also found Baltic amber and obsidian from the Mediterranean, materials that didn't just wander there by accident. They were traded, passed, hand to hand, village to village, sometimes over hundreds of kilometers. This all points to a Copper Age Europe that was more interconnected than we might think. The Alps were not a remote, inaccessible place. They were a passageway. Traders, migrants, and ideas moved through these valleys just as they would along the great rivers and coastal plains of the continent. And yet, despite this openness, Caesar's genome tells a story of remarkable genetic isolation. 4 generations! His community remained distinct, stable, perhaps, but also vulnerable to the sweeping changes that would soon arrive. So what kind of society produced a man like Caesar? The new DNA study hints at a small, agriculturally based community, one where farming and hunting existed side by side. The men stayed put, inheriting land and lineage. The women came from elsewhere, joining their husbands and bringing with them new genetic variation. This balance of continuity and movement may have given the region both stability and flexibility, a structure that worked for thousands of years. But eventually, it began to crack, as groups from the east began to migrate westward, first in trickles, then in waves. Genetic makeup of the Alps started to shift. Steppe ancestry, with its links to the horse riding, Yamnaya, and later Bronze Age cultures, began to appear in the DNA of alpine individuals. These newcomers brought with them not just genes, but also new technologies, horse domestication, wheeled carts, and bronze tools that outmatched anything the older communities had. By the time the bell beaker culture spread through Europe, these changes had taken root. The genetic isolation that once defined Caesar's people was breaking down. Intermarriage, migration, and cultural fusion began to reshape the highlands. C himself wouldn't have lived to see this transformation, but he stood on the threshold of it. His life, and especially his death, mark the end of an era, and in that way, his body becomes more than just an archaeological curiosity. It becomes a time capsule, a single person, frozen in a moment that bridges two worlds, the insular farming communities of the Neolithic and the emerging dynamic societies of the Bronze Age. His tools, his genes, and even the undigested contents of his stomach speak to that balance between old and new, between survival and change. There's also a kind of poetry in the way Tihi was found. Alone, high in the mountains, far from any known settlement. If he were a member of a settled, cooperative community, why was he up there, isolated and injured? Had he been exiled? Was he on a journey, or was he fleeing something? Given his rare DNA both, his unusual Y chromosome, and his entirely unique mitochondrial lineage, as possible he was an T, just genetically distinct, but socially marginal as well. Someone whose family ties had frayed. Someone who might have strayed too far from the known paths. We can't know for sure. But in the ambiguity lies the magic of his story.
The mystery surrounding Cece's final hours continues to stir debate. His body wasn't just found alone. It was found well-equipped with tools, gear, and even unfinished arrows in his quiver. This wasn't a man fleeing in haste. It's more like someone who had ventured into the high mountains prepared, perhaps even on a purposeful journey. Yet, he died violently with an arrowhead embedded in his left shoulder and a wound to the head, possibly from a fall or a blow. It doesn't line up with a peaceful death or an accident. Was attacked, but by whom and why? Several theories have emerged over the decades. Some suggest a targeted murder, possibly an ambush by someone he knew. Another leans toward ritual violence, the kind carried out to settle disputes or mark the end of a life through ceremony. But now, with this new genetic evidence, we have a third possibility. That C was a genetic outsider in a world growing increasingly homogeneous. A fading remnant of an older lineage, perhaps no longer fully integrated into the shifting landscape of Alpine society. Imagine a community where everyone is beginning to share similar genes, similar customs, and perhaps even similar beliefs. Then imagine someone like Z carrying rare genetic signatures, descended from a lineage not shared by others, showing up with tools and gear from far-off regions. Would he have been seen as a stranger? Even if he spoke the same language, would that difference have been enough to make him a target? It's a haunting thought. That identity in the Copper Age may not have rested only on how someone lived, but on who their ancestors were. And if that's true, then Cece's fate might reflect more than a random act of violence. It might have been the result of long-standing tensions, suspicions, or rivalries between different groups occupying overlapping territory. And yet, even if he was killed for being different, he was remarkably connected to his world. His possessions tell us he wasn't some isolated wanderer. The copper axe alone is a key clue. In an era where copper metallurgy was just emerging, the fact that he carried such a sophisticated tool, crafted hundreds of kilometers to the south, suggests he was part of a trade network. Maybe even someone with status or special knowledge. Some researchers have even speculated that Ti could have been a sort of itinerant specialist, a healer, metalworker, or emissary moving between Alpine communities. His gear supports that idea. Carried 2 birch bark containers, likely for transporting embers or medicinal plants. One even contained traces of maple charcoal, possibly used to keep a fire going during long travels. His bow was unfinished, suggesting he might have been repairing or crafting gear on the move. He had fungus known for its antibacterial properties, potentially used for medicine. These aren't the possessions of someone merely surviving. They're the toolkit of someone who had purpose, knowledge, and maybe even expertise. Which leads to a deeper, more personal question. Who was Ci really? Was he a traitor crossing the Alps, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? A man of high status attacked in a political feud? A wanderer pushed out of his community? Or was he a bridge, someone who lived between worlds, between old lineages and new populations, between settled life and mobile exchange? Can't assign him a single identity, but we can say this. He wasn't typical. His DNA, his tools, and the circumstances of his death all point to someone on the margins or perhaps ahead of his time. And that's what makes him so powerful as a figure in our shared history. We Danti remember him simply because his body was preserved. We remember him because that preservation revealed something rare. Not just bones and tools, but a glimpse into how societies change, how people move, how identities clash or dissolve. Susie's story is a reminder that even 5,000 years ago, humanity was anything but static. Even in the most remote corners of the Alps, people were connected by blood, trade, and ideas. And even in those high, frozen valleys, there were tensions between tradition and innovation, between insiders and outsiders, between the known and the unknown. In many ways, Sai was a man living at the edge not just of his environment, but of an era. He carried within him the deep legacy of Anatolian farmers, whose genes had spread across Europe for thousands of years. But he also lived just before the dawn of a new epoch, the Bronze Age, when steppe migrations. New technologies and new languages would sweep across the continent and rewrite the human story. C didn't live to see that future, but his death marks the twilight of one world and the approach of another.
What's striking is how TC, in his death, became a messenger for both the past and the future. Frozen in time, he tells us not just how people lived 5,300 years ago, but also how they changed, adapted, and sometimes disappeared. His body became a map, not just of a single man's journey, but of human movement across millennia. We know now that the people C belonged to the early European farmers descended from Anatolian migrants, whence dominated the genetic landscape of Europe. For thousands of years, they spread across the continent, bringing agriculture, village life, and permanent home. They cleared forests, planted grain, domesticated animals, and built long-lasting community. Cece's genome is a kind of fossil of that expansion, preserved right at the edge of its end. But then came the steppe migrations. These were people with very different roots, descendants of mobile herders from the Pontic, Caspian steppe, who had mastered the horse, built wagons, and carried a very different genetic signature. When they moved into Europe, they didn't just bring new tools or languages. They brought a new way of life, more mobile, more hierarchical, perhaps more violent. The shift was massive. In some parts of Europe, especially in the north and west, the arrival of steppe ancestry coincides with dramatic genetic turnover. Up to 90% of the local male lines were replaced. It's one of the most profound demographic shifts in prehistoric Europe, and it happened within just a few centuries. But in the High Alps, these people held on at least for a while. That's part of what makes his DNA so valuable. It captures a moment when the wave of change had not yet crested. His community still reflected the old world. Anatolian ancestry, minimal outside admixture, and local traditions passed down through generations. But all around him, that was changing. And perhaps, just perhaps, the tensions that led to his death were born from that pressure, cultural, genetic, and social. What's just as fascinating is what this means for modern people. For years, many assumed that Europeans were a relatively stable genetic group, that the people living in a region today are more or less descended from those who lived there in ancient times. But Sissy's genome and others like his show that Europe has been a continent of constant change. Whole populations have been replaced. Entire genetic lineages, like Sissy's maternal line, have disappeared. And that makes C Not just rare, but precious. Because he carried something that no one today does. His mtDNA haplogroup K1F is now extinct. That means no living person carries the same maternal line as CIE. A branch of the human family tree that once stretched across valleys and villages has now ended with him. We don't know why or how, but it's gone. That makes C not just a man of the past, but the last of his kind. And yet, in a strange way, he's also one of the most connected figures in all of his, not through his descendants, but through his data. Every year, thousands of researchers study his genome, his bones, his tools. His story is taught in classrooms. His face is recreated in museums. People travel across the world just to stand near the place where he died. In death, he became immortal. But maybe that's the deeper lesson, that every person, no matter how ordinary their life may seem, holds a piece of history inside them. A story that begins long before they're born and continues long after they're gone. A mixture of genes, choices, and chances all coming together in a moment that might, if we're lucky, be preserved. See? Didn't know he would become famous. He didn't know that a shift in the ice would reveal his body after 5,000 years. He didn't know that scientists would one day read his genome like a book. But because all of that happened, we now know more about him, about ourselves, and about the winding, often invisible path of human history.
But even after all we've uncovered, C keeps some secrets buried. His final trek through the Alps, for instance, remains shrouded in ambiguity. Based on pollen and isotopic analysis, researchers have traced his movements in the days before his death. They found evidence that he traveled up and down the mountain multiple times. He was likely not just wandering aimlessly, he had a purpose. But what was it? Some theories propose that he was fleeing conflict, perhaps after a confrontation in the valley. Others suggest he may have been performing some kind of ritual journey, maybe a pilgrimage or a seasonal trek between settlements. His copper axe, unmatched in the region, hints at a possible leadership role. Maybe he was a figure of authority or prestige, sent to broker alliances or carry important knowledge. And yet, he died alone, with unfinished arrows and a half-crafted bow. It's hard not to imagine a narrative. A man of importance, targeted by rivals, betrayed or attacked during a critical moment. But perhaps we're projecting. The truth might be simpler, or even stranger. He could have been injured during a hunt, then finished off by an opportunistic attacker. Or perhaps he had been ostracized by his community and was trying to survive on his own in the harsh alpine wilderness. Still, the forensic evidence paints a dramatic picture. The arrow wound in his shoulder was likely fatal, piercing a major artery. Traces of blood from multiple individuals were found on his weapons, suggesting a violent encounter, perhaps even a fight for survival. He had defensive wounds on his hands and signs of blunt trauma to his skull, possibly from a final blow delivered after he was already weakened. All of this points to a story that ends in violence. But was it personal, political, ceremonial? We may never know. And that S part of the magnetism of C.S. Storiette, S both specific and universal. A man caught in a moment of change. A human life suddenly interrupted, leaving behind just enough evidence to intrigue, but not enough to explain. His belongings deep in the mystery. His shoes, meticulously crafted from deer hide and grass, were perfectly suited for long alpine journeys. His coat was made from goat and sheepskins, stitched together with remarkable skill. He even had a grass cape for warmth or camouflage, and a belt pouch containing flint tools, a scraper, and tinder fungus. This wasn't a man unprepared. He knew how to survive, and yet he didn't. Maybe that's the most human part of the story. Not even someone well-equipped with knowledge and experience can be overtaken by events beyond their control. That no amount of preparation guarantees survival, especially in a world as unforgiving as the Neolithic Alps. But in death, C gains something few others have, an eternal presence in human memory. He's been called the Iceman, the Alpine mummy, the Copper Age traveler. His face has been reconstructed, his meals analyzed, his bones scanned and rescanned. And through it all, we keep returning to one simple truth: he was one of us. A man with fears and hopes, a body that aged, hurt, and healed, a mind that navigated landscapes of stone and snow, laughed, ate, slept, and likely loved. And for all our modern technology, we still stand before his frozen form with awe, because beneath the science and speculation, there's something else, a connection. Across 5,000 years, we see in C not just a relic, but a reflection, a reminder that every human life, no matter how ancient or remote, matters, that each person leaves a mark, however faint, on the great canvas of time. Today, CI lies in a specially designed chamber in the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy. Kept at a constant -6 degrees Celsius with controlled humidity, he rests in the same frozen stillness that preserved him for more than 5 millennia. Visitors from around the world peer through a small window into this cold, sterile tomb, catching a glimpse of a man who lived and died before the pyramids, before Stonehenge, before writing itself. It's strangely intimate looking at someone so ancient and yet so familiar. His skin, leathery and dark from centuries in ice, still carries tattoos, more than 60 of them, made by rubbing charcoal into tiny incisions. These aren't decorative, they align with known acupuncture points, suggesting CIA may have suffered from chronic pain and used this early form of therapy. It's possible, even probable, that he hurt often arthritis, worn joints, parasite sol, signs of a life of hardship. He endured, he adapted. He carried medicines in his pouch, birch polypore fungus, to treat infections, fire-starting tools, and carefully shaped blades. He wasn't a passive figure of the past. He was proactive, resourceful, and skilled. He was human, not a symbol. But symbols are powerful. Over the decades, Cease has come to represent more than himself. He's a bridge between science and storytelling, between data and myth. He reminds us of how little separates us from our distant ancestors. Our tools may be sleeker, our lives more digital, but our basic needs, shelter, safety, meaning, remain the same. What makes CS story so gripping? Isn't just the age or the mystery it is, the fragility? His body, after 5,300 years, could have vanished forever. A little more melting, a few more decades of snowmelt, and his remains might have been lost. Instead, he emerged, just as humanity gained the tools to understand him. Carbon dating, CT scanning, DNA sequencing. It was, in many ways, perfect timing. And now, as climate change accelerates the melting of glaciers around the world, more such discoveries may await. Bodies, artifacts, forgotten stories, rising again from the ice. But C was the first. And like all firsts, he holds a unique place not just in archaeology, but in our imagination. He asks us to look back, not to romanticize the past, but to learn from it. To understand that every tool, every choice, every scar tells a story, and that even the coldest, loneliest mountain pass can echo with memory. So as we leave him behind, sealed in his chamber, we carry something with us, a deeper sense of time, reverence for the people who came before, and the realization that history isn't just written in books or carved in stone also frozen in flesh, waiting to be found. And perhaps, someday, someone will find pieces of USRO tools, our words, our traces, and wonder who we were, how we lived, and what stories we left behind in the ice.